Welcome to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. As you well know by now, if you've been watching some of these programs, that we've been doing weekly programs for almost 2 years now. We work at bringing you some of the more interesting and exciting, as well as probably some of the dull and drudgery things related to health. Just got some interesting news today. As some of you have probably heard on the news, that the Hostess company has been having some problems, and they were afraid that they weren't going to make it, and they had, as the news said, filed in bankruptcy court for court protection so they could continue, and various things happened. Of course, the employees decided to go on strike, and so Hostess was closing down plants and firing those who did, and I don't know if they're totally closed yet or not, but it doesn't look good. At any rate, some people have rushed out to buy their supply ahead just in case that they do totally flop, so that they won't run out of their favorite Twinkies, etc., etc. At any rate, it was noted that someone bought a huge box ahead, so they would have them for quite a while, and this, of course, is 2012, and they noted that the expiration date is 2025. Am I correct? I was asking my producer. So yeah, that seems to be that you don't have to worry about them spoiling. Probably the wrapper would deteriorate before the product would spoil. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that it has been embalmed when it was made, and embalmed in such a way, like a mummy, that it probably would hang on forever. I'm not so sure I want to put that in my body, but that's kind of the nature, as we've been talking about in some of the last broadcasts, about food and the quality of food, and what happens if you eat food that doesn't have any quality, what it does to your health. But don't worry, you can go out and spend thousands of dollars over the next several years managing symptoms that were created because of that. Now, all of that being said, I kind of like to bring you breaking news sometimes, and maybe a comment or two on it. I've chosen a subject today that I'm sure everyone has heard of, and people have heard the term thrown about quite a bit, sometimes in a humorous way, sometimes in a critical, condemning way. And the subject that I've chosen is Placebo-Nocebo. What do you think? Now, if you've paid any attention at all, and of course there are some who don't, the subject of placebo has been applied, I would say, more often by the medical establishment to people who go to some other type of therapy rather than taking real drug therapy, and referred to, well, the stuff that they were using just was placebo. It really didn't have any effect. Never mind that the person got better, it just was placebo, so we can just rule that out and wipe it aside because it has no real meaning. We only do scientific medicine. Now, I want you to keep that term in mind as we talk about the subject of placebos and nocebos, about scientific medicine. Now, you know what science really is. You know, if you're really going to be a scientist, there's certain conditions of mind that are necessary if you're really going to be a scientist. That means, first of all, if you initiate a study of a subject, you have no preconceived ideas or opinions about what it is, the mechanism of it, or what the outcome would be of the study. Now, if that's going to be truly scientific, truly objective, you enter with no preconceived opinions or prejudices. Now, that in itself is extremely difficult, because depending on your basic philosophy of life, can predetermine where you have prejudices. For example, if you have a materialistic, reductionistic assumption about the world, that all there is what your eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and eyes and touch, if that's all there is, then that is a certain assumption, and that's a presumption. So automatically you're going to rule out a whole long list of things, and therefore if you do research, you are not going to be totally objective, and therefore you could not call that really scientific. So if you say, well, I know that the diseases are real, and they take place in a real body that's subject to all of these senses, and so anything that goes beyond that we cannot consider, i.e. mind. In other words, we only can look at the tissue, what we would call the tissue. So right away you're going to rule out a certain set of influences or effects that go beyond the physical. So therefore you will conclude ultimately from whatever you're studying that something is or is not true based on having ruled out in advance, not during the study, but in advance, certain findings. So if that outcome does not meet your expectations, now what do you think that most researchers are going to do with that? Well, you can bet it's not going to be published, and it's not going to be talked about because it did not meet with your expectations. Now, just keep in mind, if you had expectations, then it's not truly research. For example, there is a book out, or actually a series of books, by Dr. Gary Schwartz from the University of Arizona in Tucson. Gary Schwartz is a PhD researcher, graduated from Harvard University, and at some point took a position as a professor of several things related to research and actually in medicine and health at the University of Arizona. So one of the first books he wrote, again based on non-prejudicial research, as much as you can get, he wrote a book called The Living Energy Universe, which actually was based on a series of studies. Some of them started at Princeton University under the PAIR project, and continued on with himself and a research assistant at the University of Arizona. And so what he concluded, that there's a whole lot more out in the world and that causes things to happen and that do happen than has been previously acknowledged or accepted. And so he knew he was treading on dangerous grounds, because if you want to maintain your position as a scientific investigator, then you have to play the game according to the scientific investigator rules of making certain presumptions. In other words, we can't consider certain things, again, because they don't fit within the materialistic reductionistic paradigm. And a paradigm means like a box. So you create this box with a set of borders or walls, and therefore in your mind you believe all that's real will only be within that box. Anything that comes along that's outside that box you don't consider, because it couldn't possibly be real, because here's the boundaries of what is real. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't work, and Gary Schwartz found himself at odds with what he had been taught, but what he had found. And fortunately, he had done a lot of research without prejudice, and therefore came up with conclusions that contradicted modern science. And So the book he wrote, The Living Energy Universe, had a lot of information about alternative healing and alternative therapies, such as homeopathy, the laying on of hands, healing touch from the nursing profession and Dolores Krieger, prayer, etc. There was a whole list of things, and he says, well, really, when you move to the broader field of physics, which has to take in quantum physics, then there really is an explanation, a rational explanation as to how these things work. Well, as time went on, some other things happened to him, and as a result of that, he ended up setting up another research study, and without getting into too many details about it, the basic idea was he and his assistant had to travel from Arizona to California on a particular trip to carry out some business, and they walked into this office, and a lady in the office looked at his assistant, who was also a lady, and said, I have a message for you from your father. Okay, neither of the two had ever met. The lady at the office had no knowledge that they were coming there, and in particular, this lady coming with him. And so when she saw her, she had this impression that she had a message from her father. Now, the interesting thing was her father was deceased. And so the lady proceeded to tell her information that she knew for a fact that only her and her father knew before he died. So no one else had ever been told or knew it, yet this lady, who had never met her, had never met the father, knew nothing about any of this, got this impression that the father was sending a message to his daughter through this lady. Now that was quite unsettling to Dr. Schwartz and his assistant. They had never experienced anything like that. And as a result of that, he went back to the university, and they sat down and talked about it. And so they decided, I want to set up an experiment, because I've heard that there are people who have the dead talk through them back, and therefore I wonder if it's real or if it's some kind of deception or whatever. In other words, now his scientific research part of his mind is taking over, and says, I wonder, could we set up a project, a research project, that would test this to see if there is some strong evidence that it's true. So as a consequence, he created this whole study, and it went on for quite some time. He brought in several of the people who had been recognized and thought to be someone who could bring this information from the other side, whatever that is, to this side. And John Edward was one. I'm sure if you've been paying any attention at all over the years, you've seen that he's been on TV many times. He's written out several books. And I have observed him, and he brings out information that he should not know and no one else. And we're talking about spontaneous information coming out to someone he's never met before. Just out of the blue, he gets this impression, and he gives out this information. Okay, so he was one of several that were brought in to do these studies. Now, if you read the book that was published as a result of these studies, is that Gary Schwartz wrestled with himself, because once he had completed the study, the evidence indicated that it was true, and yet a part of him, as having been trained in traditional research, said it can't be true. And so he said, however, and he wrestled with himself, however, the evidence shows that it is true, and therefore, as an honest researcher, I have to present that and let other people look at it and draw their conclusions from what occurred. And so he wrote a book called The Afterlife Experiments, and he published it knowing that it could be very damaging to him and the scientific community, because it was, as he carried out and made all kinds of controls so that it couldn't be faked, and yet it came out convincingly that it was true. And so you can read his books, and in fact he has several books out now, and you will see here's a guy who starts out as a traditional researcher, but fortunately an honest researcher, and is willing to look at something that would be a contradiction to what he was taught as a research PhD, and yet felt compulsion to let it be known because it seemed to be true from all the controls. And he's not saying it's the final word, and other researchers who are willing to set up the same experiment is fine, but he, to be honest, even though it didn't come out the way he anticipated, because he really thought, when I set up this study and put all these controls in there, it's going to prove that it's phony. That was what he thought probably is going to happen. But nonetheless, he was willing to look at all the evidence, and to his surprise, it came out the other way. Now see, to me, that's true research. But whenever you decide that, okay, we're going to do this experiment, but we know that this can't be true and this can't be true, because we already know that that's phony. At least they're assuming it. So those are left out, and so if something comes up that would tend to indicate that maybe some of these other things were true, that research gets filed away and no one ever gets to look at it, because it doesn't meet with the expectation of the researcher. Okay, I'm saying all that because the subject that we're doing today on placebo happens to be one of those areas that when you really get into it, you find that it rattles a lot of chains, and it disturbs a lot of people who depend on it really not being true so that they can sell a lot of medications. Now, if you listen to some of this stuff and you start to look into it, you're going to find it's interesting. First of all, once I talk a little bit about nocebo and placebo and so forth, then we're going to see how far back the stuff has been known that I'm going to talk about as to what is really going on. Now, I know that, as I say, the ads on medicine always are talking about scientific medicine. My finding of scientific medicine is that in most cases it's about as unscientific as you can get, because there's always this presumed things that can't be true, therefore get excluded. So if they run 10 studies, which they never usually run that many, but if they were to run 10 studies and 6 came out against a medication and 4 in favor of it, guess what? The 6 would be laid aside and not published, and only the 4 that seem to favor it would be included for you to know about and to present to the FDA as proof that this medication can be effective. Now, I want you to pay a lot of attention to this, because I've been talking some about the tremendous sickness bill in this country, and I've talked about the nutritional side and the problems with that. I've talked about the mental side in certain respects. But now we want this to go a step further and kind of bring the drugs head to head with other issues that may cause you to think maybe the drugs are not what they are proposed to be. And many people, of course, already know that because they've had experience with them, that the adverse effects are worse than any benefit that they could have. You know, things like death and strokes and heart attacks and little things like that. Those are some of those side effects. Now, remember again, I mentioned before that an acquaintance of mine said that that was a invented term by Wall Street to minimize the many strong adverse effects of the drugs that were being peddled. And so if you would have said, now this has several very, very serious adverse effects, you're going to take this for a drippy nose and irritable eyes, but, and in a very soft voice, very rapidly, in the background almost, however, this could cause a blood clot, it could cause a stroke, cause a heart attack, and death. Okay, now, that's only side effects. Real effects is your eyes and nose are going to feel a lot better. Now, the interesting thing is that most drugs that get put on the market, and this was admitted by one of the high-level officials of one of the major drug companies, are only about 40% effective for what they're sold for. Now what that means is 10 people buy the drug, and only 4 out of 10 even get the effects that they wanted it for. So 6 out of the 10 are buying a worthless product for them. But that's not the worst part of it, is that then you have all these adverse effects. And almost everybody is going to get one or more of the adverse effects, whether it helps them or not. They still could get the blood clot, they still could get the heart attack, they still could get the stroke, they still could get death. But for some reason, when they change in the ad, the way they present it, and they drop down to a softer voice very rapidly and run through these side effects, it doesn't sound that bad. Or it just gets missed, period. I mean, what you see and walk away from that ad is, we have no more burny eyes and no more runny nose when we take the pill. I mean, that's what we take away. You know, they're always talk about workshops and programs, and they say, you know, the takeaway or take-home things you really should get out of this. Well, that's what you have the anticipation, and you might even question a lot of that by the time we get done with placebo and nocebos. Okay, now, placebo is interesting. It comes from the Latin, and what it really means is, I please. And so I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about, well, I've already started, but I'm going to talk a little bit about placebo and nocebo. And then we're going to look at some of the studies and implications of it. And then we're going to get into what I consider to be the real issue in the background. And you're going to find that that issue and knowledge has been around for a long, long time. There's nothing new. In fact, King Solomon said in the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible, there is no new thing under the sun. And that's probably true. We sometimes get the feeling that we are so sophisticated and so intelligent that we know all these things. But, you know, every time you go back and start looking historically, you find that, wait a minute, those people knew that 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or more. And so then we might consider that we're not as brilliant as we think we are. Now, they may have had a different way to describe it, different nomenclature coming from a different part of the world, but at the same time, they already understood the principle. And you're going to find that in a lot of cases, even in physics. There's actually some good books out on it, The Dancing Woolly Masters, and there's several books to that effect that talk about the fact they knew back in ancient India, back in ancient Samaria, back in all these periods of time, thousands of years ago, they knew the same principles of physics that now we're just uncovering again. So in my mind, these are things that we are relearning that already existed before, but people weren't aware of it. And it's quite intriguing when you read those books to find out that they just had different terms, but they were saying exactly the same thing. The other big book, there's two big ones, The Dancing Woolly Masters and The Tao of Physics. And those two show that they had all this knowledge of the universe and physics centuries ago, but when they described it, we didn't understand their way of describing it. But their way was based on their language at that time, and still underlying it, the basic principle is that they knew all about it. So it's interesting to me that we always think, well, those people were ignorant and they didn't know what they were talking about, and look at the way they describe these things, blah, blah, blah. But not true. Okay, so placebo. What is a placebo? For a long time, it was held in low regard, because if people responded to a suspect treatment, we said it was just the placebo effect. As I said, it had a kind of a negative connotation, but it really means to please. In other words, the implication is that if you take this pill, you get a response that's going to please the person who gave you the pill. So, and also we need to differentiate between placebo, meaning a substance that is supposedly inert, versus one that actually is supposed to have some medicinal effect. So that's one way to look at the placebo. The placebo effect is what happens in the person who takes it, whether they knew or did not know that it was a placebo. They, in effect, get a response. So if you gave a sugar pill for a bad pain in the shoulder, and that's what they call it, because a lot of them had basically sugar in them, supposedly it's an inert substance. Okay, so you have a shoulder pain, you take this pill, and pretty soon the pain leaves. So you say, wow, this was really a good painkiller. Okay, now you only find out later that it was an inert substance, had no treatment capability at all, and if you could give it to 1,000 people in their food and nothing would happen, because they did not know that it was supposed to be, or at least it leads you to believe it was a pill. So, as I say, because medicine tries to poo-poo every therapy that doesn't come from them and the pharmaceutical companies, then if you go and get acupuncture, well, that's just placebo. Which means, okay, you imagined it was going to help, and it did. Well, when you think about that, you can apply that to regular medicine, and you're going to see that as we start looking at the drug trials and what's been happening. And what I was just looking at here is from the Harvard Health publications from Harvard Medical School, Trusted Advice for a Healthier Life. And it says putting the placebo effect to work. And so they start talking about placebo, and they're saying attitudes are shifting even in conventional medical circles. Randomized trials, some of them led by researchers at the Harvard-wide program in placebo studies and the therapeutic encounter, have deepened the understanding of the placebo effect and its various components. Now, they said the suggestion was that people had been fooled before with using the term placebo. So, okay, acupuncture didn't work because it was a placebo. Really work. It's a placebo because the people thought it would help. It did help, and so that's negative. You should really not go for acupuncture because you're not getting real therapy. But now they're saying, okay, so we realize that there can be something called a placebo effect, and that now some of the studies are indicating that doesn't mean it's bad, and that maybe you can make use of it. And that's what the article is, putting the placebo effect to work. Okay, so now if you start Googling and doing a lot of research, and especially if you can put your wording correct, you can dig up all kinds of things, and I did. I brought up dozens of articles, and of course I have read some books and studied it over the year, and I've worked with all the things that we're talking about here clinically, which, like I mentioned, acupuncture, and I didn't mention homeopathy yet, but that's the medical system that medicine has referred to as it's nothing but a sugar pill, it's just placebo, there's no possible way it could help you. forget the fact that people get better. It couldn't possibly help you. Again, going back to the paradigm thing. Well, we know that it's too weak to help, so therefore it couldn't possibly really help you. But if you think it could help you, then it might help you because of the placebo effect. But that's bad, because then the people didn't take the real medicine. Now, I hope this is all kind of beginning to come together and make some sense to you. Now, as we take this just a little bit farther, it says the placebo effect. This is another study, another article written about it. Studies reveal how fake medicine actually reduces pain. And I mentioned about the shoulder pain earlier. So here they've gone through a bunch of studies, and it says a team of researchers smears a cream said to contain a powerful anesthetic on the skin of your forearm. Then, in their mad scientist way, they apply an electric heating pad that can be dialed up to painfully hot levels. Imagine being pleasantly surprised to find that the cream works. The heat seems quite bearable. The researchers even run a brain scan to document just how well the cream works. But picture your dismay at learning that the cream was actually inert and contained no anesthetic. Now what do? Guileless lab rat that you are, you have been punked by a placebo. Scenes like this are playing out in the US and European laboratories as neuroscientists try to figure out how our brains can be tricked by sham treatments into producing potent pain-blocking effects that rival and may sometimes enhance the effects of real drugs. Now there's that real drug. Sometimes you wonder if there is such a thing as a real drug. There are drugs, of course, that can be toxic if you get enough of them. But even that, sometimes it seems, can be overcome if you expect something different. So anyhow, many papers published in Science. Now, people who are not in the scientific world or the medical world may not know about Science, but there's two publications that are considered the top publications in the world. And to get a paper published in one of those, it has to be what's called peer-reviewed, meaning a panel of supposed specialists in that particular subject have to read it and agree that all the criteria of true research was met and that it actually is proving some significant issue before it can be published in there. And if it meets all that criteria, it can be published. So Science covers the whole realm of science, including medicine. And the second big journal is The Lancet, which is a worldwide medical journal. And so the same thing happens there, except they publish only articles related in some way to medicine. So if you can get published in either of those, that means that your material and your methodology had to be scrutinized by a lot of people who would just be just as happy to say, look, here's the problem with that. It doesn't meet all the criteria, so we won't publish it. So a lot of articles get rejected. In fact, probably more get rejected than get accepted. So I'm saying that to say that when you start seeing articles on placebo published in Science, then you know that this is material that has been really scrutinized before it ever got there. And so what they're finding now is that in these studies, that the placebo, meaning using a substance that does not really have supposed painkillers in it, still can reduce pain. And it says, until now it was believed that placebo was just a psychological phenomenon that had no neurobiological basis, but that's really not the case. Ellipert, this researcher, said, he noted that naloxone did not completely erase the pain relief effect, suggesting that placebo treatment may also engage other less studied brain networks. Okay, and I don't know what you know about naloxone, but it's a chemical that was found that if you're taking opiates or painkillers, and you take naloxone, it neutralizes the effect of the painkiller so that it won't work. Okay, so anyhow, they found that it didn't completely erase it from a placebo. So now, wow, what's going on? What they did find that the scientists studied subjects' brains with a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner and asked them to subjectively rate the pain intensity. Those who received naloxone, which blocked opioid activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and midbrain structures, etc. Anyhow, they found that they saw markedly lower pain relief than those who had received saline. Until now, it was believed that placebo was just a psychological phenomenon, but it's proving not the case. So it's kind of interesting material. Now, this is stuff that's coming up, and it's pretty new. For a long time, it was talked about, as I said, but only in a negative way. This was published in 2009. Okay, so here's another article. Placebo effect works even if patients know they're getting a sham drug. Now, this is the one that to me is fascinating. Because here's people who are given a placebo, but they're told they're getting a placebo. And yet, when they take it, whatever the problem was they took it for, they got improvement. Now, that's a wild one. It says patients can benefit from being treated with sham drugs. Now, sham is a term they came up to mean that it doesn't, I know we use sham in a really negative way. That's a sham. But what it really means is it's a drug that's not really a drug. Okay, so patients can benefit from being treated with sham drugs even if they are told they contain no active ingredient. Scientists have found. The findings suggest that the placebo effect could work without the need for any deception on the part of the doctor, as had been previously thought. So they thought, okay, placebo might work because the people expect it to work because the doctor said it's the right thing that would work. And it was a good, powerful drug. Now they're saying, well, even if you tell the people it's a sham, that it's not really a drug, it still can work. Now, that's interesting because I have to tell you another story. Many people, I'm sure, have heard of NLP, Neuro-Linguistic Programming. Well, anyhow, one of the originators of NLP is kind of a cut-up in some respects. He's a bit mischievous, interesting person. Anyhow, somehow he got onto this whole idea of placebo. And of course, if you don't know anything about NLP, NLP has to do with the way linguistics affect neurology. So hence, neuro-lingual linguistic programming. I guess that's the term. Neuro-linguistic programming. So how the linguistics or the thoughts or words affect the neurology. Okay, so he's thinking, would be interesting if I produced a product and named it placebo and put on the label, active ingredients, none, indications, none, and sold it, or at least put it out on the market. Do you think people might buy it? And so he did, and so they did. People saw it, it said placebo, and when they looked at the label, it says there's no active ingredients and there's no indications. They took it home and took it, and after a while he started being contacted by many of these people saying, wow, this stuff works really good. I was having terrible headaches and I started taking this and they've disappeared. Or I was having terrible back pain and I started taking this product and they disappeared. I really like it. So, being as mischievous as he is, he said, well, maybe some people might like something even stronger. So he put out a second product called Placebo Extra Strength. And that's what the label said. Okay, on the ingredients it said active ingredients none, indications none. And then he started getting contacted by people who bought it saying, wow, this new product is even more powerful. I took the other and it helped pretty good, but now this one is really powerful. And of course, at that point, the FDA stepped in and said, you can't sell this product. And he says, why not? It's perfectly labeled. It says that it's a placebo. It says it doesn't have any active ingredients. And it says there's no indications for its use. He didn't say it helped anything. But they said, well, you're going to give people the wrong idea. Well, now that I've studied in depth more with placebo, I'm beginning to think, no wonder they didn't want it to happen, because now you're going to find out that a high percentage of the drugs out there are more likely to work for placebo effect, if at all, and that most of them, when they're being tested, don't hardly exceed the effects of the placebo that part of the group were taking. One popular antidepressant that came on the market actually, as far as I could find, came out lower than the placebo. And yet it ended up on the market. In other words, it appears to me that if you put out a product and you jump through all the hoops and then you make your final application to the FDA, you're probably going to get it approved, if at least equal the placebo. But my feeling is, why not put the placebo on the market and charge a whole lot less, because it has no active ingredients in it, and help people with no toxic adverse effects. Although it seems that sometimes people, if they think it helps, they also think that it has brought on some adverse effects. So we might get into that before we get done with this whole thing. But it looks like this is a very interesting study. And the more I've gotten into it, you know, I knew a lot about it because of some other things that I have done over the years. And I never looked at it as a negative. I looked at it as an expectation that people have. And so when they expect that it was going to help, it would help, whether it did or, I mean, whether it in fact helped as far as chemically, but it certainly helped as far as symptoms. Okay, so now here they're finding out, as this acquaintance of mine I'm talking about found out, that people can even know it's a placebo and it still can have have an effect. In fact, yeah, it could have some side effects, but again, how does that happen? Okay, so there was a big study done about the placebo and also the nocebo. Now, you're probably wondering about the nocebo. Beware the nocebo effect. Here's an article that was put out by some researchers. Everyone knows, well, of course everyone doesn't really know, I guess, because some people don't know that. Everyone knows that a placebo, a fake medication or sham procedure typically used as a control in a medical trial, can nonetheless have a positive effect, relieving real symptoms like pain, bloating, or a depressed mood. The placebo effect is a result of the patient's expectation that the treatment will help. Kind of interesting. So, as I say, it isn't as negative today as it was, but it always is negative when applied by medicine to any other treatment is not one of their treatments, such as acupuncture, homeopathy, herbs, a lot of other things, nutrition. Well, the only reason that it helped because of a placebo effect. The people that thought it helped, but it didn't really. But nonetheless, they got better, which is interesting to me. Okay, so, but now this article takes this a step further and says, but expectations can also do harm. When a patient anticipates a pill's possible side effects, he can suffer them even if the pill is fake. Fortunately, this NLP individual did not put any adverse effects on it, so the people who took his placebo got no adverse effect. This nocebo effect has been largely overlooked by researchers, clinicians, and patients. In an article recently published in the journal Deutsche Arztblatt International, we and our colleague Erno Hansen reviewed 31 studies conducted by us and other researchers that demonstrated the nocebo effect. We urge doctors and nurses to be more mindful of its dangers, particularly when informing patients about a treatment's potential complications. Consider the number of people in medical trials who, through receiving placebos, stopped participating because of its side effects. We found that 11% of the people in a fibromyalgia drug trial were taking fake medication dropped out of the studies because of the side effects like dizziness and nausea. Other researchers reported that the discontinuation rates because of side effects in placebo groups in migraine or tension drug studies were as much as 5% discontinuation rates. In other products, such as statins, range from 4 to 26%. In a curious study, the team of Italian gastroenterologists asked people with and without diagnosed lactose intolerance to take lactose for an experiment on its effect on bowel symptoms. But in reality, the participants received glucose, which does not harm the gut. Nonetheless, 44% of the people with known lactose intolerance and 26% of those without lactose intolerance complained of gastrointestinal symptoms. Bottom line is, if you have an expectation that it could be negative, it does, or if people plant a lot of negative attitudes, what they found was in surgery. Now, this isn't in all the stuff I have here, but I just remember a study that if, while the person's out in surgery, you have to remember that the anesthetic does not put them to sleep, it renders them unconscious. In other words, it knocks out certain conscious centers, but the person is still hearing and perceiving and so forth, even though they're not consciously aware of it. And so if the doctors have a person and they open them up and they see a really bad situation and they comment about, oh, look at that, I'll be surprised if this person survives, guess what? That person's not likely to survive because they heard that. And it made an impression on the subconscious mind, even though consciously they didn't hear it and they didn't remember it after the surgery. On the other hand, if they were given some kind of a positive statement, like even if it was real bad, well, I believe this person will be able to survive this. It looks like we've gotten all of the problem out. Those people would do very well, even though they didn't know that the doctor said anything about their problem during the procedure. So it's interesting how these effects can be so powerful, and that's what we're going to eventually talk about out of this whole thing, is why, how it really works. That's what I really want to talk about. But we're having to go through all this to get you to that. Now, I'm looking at another article, Nocebo Effect, not Placebo Effect, Induced Illness Study. Negative suggestion, this was in the Science Daily in 2012, in July. Negative suggestion can induce symptoms of illness. Nocebo effect are the adverse events that occur during sham treatment and or as a result of negative expectations. While the positive counterpart, the placebo effect, has been intensively studied in recent years, the scientific literature contains few studies on nocebo phenomena. In the latest issue of, again, this place, they talk about the fact that these people experience these negative effects. Now, this was one of the most surprising things of all. I alluded to it in one of the other materials that I just gave you. But study, now this is a big study that was done, and again, this is pretty new stuff. It's this year, 2012. A new study finds that the placebo effect actually alters brain activity. Now, that's taking it a big step forward. They're just saying, well, it's your imagination, you didn't really have an effect from this thing. But now what they're finding is when they actually hook them up and study them with the brain, that they're actually having a brain change. The study was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, and it was the first of its kind to suggest that patients with major depression who received placebos experienced changes in brain function similar to changes caused by medication. Kind of wild stuff. Now, I was going to bring up another book, and I don't know if we're going to get to it yet or not. But anyhow, it has to do with that same subject, and hopefully maybe we can get to that. It really can be beyond function. That's why I'm saying that. Actual change in the physical structure of the brain. The double-blind study conducted by UCLA researchers used quantitative electroencephalography or QEEG imaging to look at brain activity in 51 patients who were assigned to receive either placebos or 1 or 2 antidepressant medications. After 9 weeks, the patients were classified as being medication responders, placebo responders, or non-responders to either medication or placebo. The placebo responders and the medication responders had changes in the same brain region. And the researcher was Dr. Andrew Lutzter, lead author of the study and director of adult psychiatry at the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute and Hospital. Placebo responders showed more activity in the prefrontal cortex, while medication responders showed less activity. Additionally, the decrease in depression with the placebo was the same as the improvement with the medication. Now, I don't know if you heard that or not. The decrease in depression with the placebo was the same as the improvement with medication. Now think about that. I want you to let this bounce around in your brain a little bit. Which is better, to buy a $10 pill put out by a pharmaceutical with known tremendous adverse effects, almost all of them do, in fact I don't know of any that don't, or buy a 99-cent bottle of placebo and get the same effect? Think about that. To me, this is outlandish, and we're going to talk about the implications a little bit more here yet. Now, it says a placebo, again, is a non-medication or inactive treatment is used to satisfy the patient's psychological need for medicine. In other words, just the act of taking a pill may be enough to make some people feel better, the so-called placebo effect. Well, that's what happened with the pills that were made by the guy from NLP. Some experts even believe the placebo effect accounts for as much as 100% of the efficacy of medication, according to Dr. J. Alexander Rodkin, director of the Clinical Psychopharmacology Research Program at McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts. Now again, did that hit? He believes that the placebo effect amounts for as much as 100% of the efficacy of medication. In other words, I know, and all the studies show, that probably about 40% is the efficacy of a drug, if you take out placebo effect. But now he's saying that that could account for 100% of the efficacy of medications. I don't know if that's clicking or not. It makes you want to rethink the whole thing about pharmacology, drugs, and medicine. Now, I'm not saying that nothing is ever useful for certain people under certain conditions, but I'm sure saying there needs to be a definite rethink about the whole idea of medications. Now, before we get out of placebo and nocebo, one doctor, in thinking about placebo, said, well, now I know that with pharmacology or drugs, placebo could be a big issue. Okay, but we know that certain things we do in medicine, placebo cannot have anything to do with that. So he said, surgery. You know, surgery is very mechanical. You are cutting in tissue, you're taking out things, you're repairing things, you're cleaning out things, whatever. So surgery could not be placebo. Okay. I have this big article. Knee surgery no better than placebo. On a scale of 0 to 10, Eugenio Perez Jr. says the pain in his knee that was once worse than 10 is no more. He suffers from degenerative joint osteoarthritis, and it took part in a clinical trial designed to test the efficacy of arthroscopic surgery on osteoarthritic knees, and has been pain-free for more than 2 years since the surgery. The interesting thing, though, is that Perez was in the sham surgery group of the study, and the researchers did almost nothing to him. Osteoarthritis, which afflicts more than 20 million Americans, is characterized by the breakdown of cartilage in the joints. Oral medications as well as lifestyle changes can treat it, but for some patients, arthroscopic surgery, in which damaged cartilage is scraped or flushed out with the aid of a thin viewing scope, is also an option. Perez was assigned to the placebo group of the trial. He was given anesthetic, and the doctors made incisions in his knee so that it looked as though he had an arthroscope inserted. This sham surgery group was compared to other patients who underwent an actual arthroscopic procedure. The study, published this week in the New England Journal of Medicine, found some surprising results. The groups were all reporting improvements. It's just that there was no greater benefit in any of the groups compared to the placebo. Dr. Bruce Mosley, lead author of the study and clinical associate professor of orthopedic surgery at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, told ABC News' Jackie Judd, "This experience has left Perez with a strong understanding of the placebo effect and how belief that a surgery can relieve pain may actually do just that. It's a mental thing," he said. "I think that if you believe in something, you can get well." Wow. And for the medical community, has led to the understanding that arthroscopic surgery is performed an estimated 200,000 times a year for the treatment of osteoarthritic knees may be useless. "My opinion is we probably shouldn't be doing it," said Mosley. Now, that was his opinion, but there's some other things. Other people have gotten into the act. For some physicians who share Mosley's opinion, the new study confirms their suspicions. It's my impression that arthroscopy is the osteoarthritic patient, I get my tongue all twisted, has already become less popular primarily because it hasn't had the benefits that people thought it would, said Dr. William W. Tipton, Jr., Executive Vice President and CEO of the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons in Rosemont, Illinois. It was believed that the often considerable pain associated with the condition could be improved surgically through flushing out and removing cartilage debris in the knee joint. Practically every report, every study that was ever done said that the majority of patients were improved after they had the surgery, said Mosley. It's just that nobody ever said that they were well. It was clear that many of the patients' early improvement would digress over time, and they would end up with knee replacement surgery. Up until now, no one had tested the surgical procedure against a placebo or sham surgery. To ferret out how much of the improvement seen following surgery is due to the surgery, actually whether it does or does not have the placebo effect. They didn't do any studies for it before. They just assumed that if they felt better, it was because of the surgery. And in a sense it was, but only because they probably believed that it would. So that adds a new light. How much does it cost to have arthroscopic surgery of the knee? I think it's probably more than $20 or $30. And yet, no better than placebo. Now with the placebo, all they did was cut through the surface tissue and then suture it back up as though they'd had the procedure done. But nothing actually went into the joint, nothing touched the joint, they didn't put any saline in, nothing. It was just pure, make it appear there was surgery when there wasn't. Okay, now, I ran across another study. I thought this was really good. Spine surgery found no better than placebo. In the past decade, a low-risk technique for repairing fractured bones in the spine has surged in popularity to an estimated 100,000 operations last year in the U.S. Okay, now, those spinal surgeries are a whole lot more than $20, a whole lot more than $100. We're talking thousands and thousands of dollars. But in the first two studies to rigorously examine the effect of the procedure, known as vertebroplasty, researchers found no detectable benefit when compared with a placebo group of patients who received a sham procedure that only mimicked the real thing. It was the latest of several cases in which a popular medical procedure has been called into question by independent studies. The results are likely to stir further debate about assertions heard often in the Washington debate over healthcare legislation that unnecessary or relatively ineffective medical procedures are contributing to soaring costs. They're right. Vertebroplasty should not be done any longer unless it's in the setting of a study, said Jeffrey Jarvik of the University of Washington, who served as a senior author of one of the studies, which was funded by the National Institute of Health. The results published in this week's New England Journal of Medicine will also focus more attention on comparative effectiveness research studies endorsed by the Obama administration and draft healthcare bills in Congress that aim to assess the benefit of different treatments already on the market. Now, it's interesting. I don't know what's going to come out of all this. But I know that many, many years ago, way back in the 70s or 80s, there was a document published by the Technology Assessment Committee in the government about medical procedures and treatments, and they found them very poorly effective. Bypass surgeries, a whole pile of things that they looked into, and ultimately, you know what happened to that report? It got put on the shelf. A few people got copies of it, but it got lost real fast because, in essence, they were saying people are paying a fortune for a lot of procedures that are doing little or nothing for them, and in many cases are probably more dangerous than the original problem that they were getting the procedure for. So anyhow, this isn't me, and not because I have chosen the field of, well, they call it alternative medicine. I consider what I do the thing that's been around for centuries. What they do today is alternative medicine. And, of course, now listen to what this article said in light of scientific medicine. Have you ever watched that when these doctors are being interviewed? Well, we do scientific medicine. And all the ads, they always indicate that it's scientific, as opposed to these other people who do these other things is unscientific. Well, I'm going to throw this in. I've mentioned it before, but I haven't mentioned it for a while. And you probably might want to look again because there's two books out. You know, because I keep hearing it over and over. Just in the last week in my office, I heard from two different patients that they were told by the doctors, there's no scientific studies for any of that stuff. You shouldn't go and get that kind of stuff. It's like years ago, I had an office with a chiropractor in Ohio before I came to Florida, which was a long time ago, 30-some years ago. Anyhow, that's when chiropractic was really being beaten up before it went to court and proved that it was effective, and that they, medical people in federal court spent a fortune to be told by the court that they could no longer criticize chiropractic and all that. Because it was shown that in many of the problems of the back, they were more effective than the orthopedic treatment was. Anyhow, the whole thing is that this guy's wife, this chiropractor, went to her family doctor for something, and he said to her, she said to him, I guess, do you think chiropractic might be beneficial? And oh, he threw his arms up in the air and fell back against the wall and exclaimed, "You wouldn't believe how many times I've been called to the emergency room at the hospital over somebody's neck being broken by a chiropractor." Now, of course, she knew better, and I know better, and anybody that has any sense knows better. That's not true. But then, some of the doctors even went so far, well, you know, they only go to school for 3 months or 6 months or something like that, which is total baloney. They have as much education as the average medical doctor, if not more so. But anyhow, just to say how these prejudices are put out there and how they've poo-pooed all these other people as being unscientific. And look, look at the procedures they're doing, that the placebo effect is equal to the procedure effect, and with no risk. You know, when you cut into somebody's back with a scalpel and start cutting around the spine, there's always the potential for some serious damage. If you don't believe me, see what the malpractice is, cost-wise, for the doctors who do that kind of surgery. And that malpractice is not up there because it's a safe procedure. Let me tell you that. So, it looks like we're getting down to kind of close the end, and I'm getting that cut your throat and shut up sign. So, we didn't get through all this. I originally thought we would in one session, but boy, we've got a lot of stuff to talk about yet. And besides, I need to give you a week now to let all this stuff process. I want you to keep in mind the claims of scientific medicine. I want you to keep in mind the need for all these expensive $1 trillion worth of drugs and procedures. And then think about what we might talk about next time. You might find it very interesting. So, don't forget to go to our website, mindyourhealthcast.com. Don't forget to tell your friends to register either on YouTube for the broadcast or to go to our site, Mind Your Healthcast, and sign there so that we can notify. We don't solicit selling you a bunch of stuff. We just notify you what the subjects are going to be that are put up new each Sunday afternoon at around 4 o'clock. Sometimes they get up a little earlier, and if there's any technical problems, a few times it's been later, but on the average it's around 4 or earlier. We welcome your comments, questions. I've received some questions, but we're open. I'm kind of getting caught up. I got behind in answering some, but we're up to date at the moment. So you can be sure to raise your questions or your criticisms or your comments. And I look forward to seeing you seeing me, because I can't see you, but I can imagine you, next week. And we'll continue, and we should be able to conclude this short presentation on placebo-nocebo. What do you think?